So what we're going to talk about today is the basics of color grading as well as contrast. So now this is really important to do, but let me caution you, it's one of the last things that you want to do, and there's a practical reason for that. And that is you don't want to do more than you have to. Color grading can take a lot of time. It's really good for those of us who are slightly obsessive compulsive. Because it's also very good for us that are good at subjective stuff, because we can kind of take something and make it into something a lot better with a good color grade. I tend to, with my style, I tend to stick with, I like more realistic colors, I like contrast, I like pop, but I don't do stuff that's really what we call subjective, where I make things really green or really blue or something like that. But some really good examples of movies that have massively subjective colors are things like, I don't know if anybody's seen The Matrix. That's one of the best ones in a lot of ways. It has incredible color that's very obvious, and the reason for that is because of the way that they do this. There's three things. You have the Matrix, and everything in the Matrix is very greenish. And then you have the real world, which is everything is very bluish. And then you have something called the construct, and that's very warm, very orange, very reddish tones. And so it's very obvious when you're in one location or another, based upon how the editing and the color grading is going. It tells you something about the movie. And that's really what good color grading does. It sets an emotional tone, so you can take something and you can make it have a different emotion because of the way you do the color. So that being said, one of the best things that I like to do, and I'll just show you kind of a way of doing this, is when I do color grading, especially if I'm going to do something very subjective, where I'm going to say take a whole video and warm it up a lot or something like that. One of the things that I'll do is I'll go through each clip, and I'm going to make each clip very flat. Well, not flat, but I'm going to make them very neutral, okay? And I'm going to get as much data out of them as I possibly can. So the way that you go ahead and do this is you'll go to, up here you've got the tabs for assembly and everything like that. You're going to click on color. Now, one of the things that's really important about this is making sure that you've got a good monitor. Now, here in the classroom, in my classroom, we've got a good monitor. But if you've got a crappy monitor at home or something like that, or even a good monitor but it's not been calibrated well, then you can't trust what you're seeing, and it's really, really, really hard to do good color management, good color grading. Actually, it's basically impossible, which is why somebody who does this for a living spends thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars on good monitors so that they can see what they're doing. When you click on color, you're going to have your video in front of you, and a lot of times you'll have like effects controls or something like this. What you want to do is click here and you want to go to the Lumetri Scopes. And this takes a little bit of time to learn how to read, but it's really, really helpful. So we'll go over that in just a second. And then over here we're going to have your Lumetri Color. And under your Lumetri Color is an interesting thing. First off, it says recap, and then it's got basically it's the name of the sequence, okay? And then here it says master, and you'll notice that after the asterisk, it has the clip name. So if I hover over that, hover over that, it'll say 2017-02-23, and then MVI 6866, and that's the name of the individual clip that we're looking at right here. And then here it'll say recap, and then the same thing. The difference here is, and this is actually really cool, you can take advantage of this. I can color grade this instance on the timeline, or I can color grade the actual master clip. Now, where that becomes really handy is if you use multiple pieces of the same clip multiple times in your timeline. Sometimes it's a lot easier to do a color grade on the master clip instead of on that individual instance on the timeline. Does that make sense to everybody how that works? Okay. So, but it's important to kind of keep track of what you're doing with that and kind of know what you're doing, because you can get lost really easily if you start editing masters a lot. because you can tack on multiple Lumetri color grades and all sorts of other stuff. But you don't have to do that. So now, if I'm going through and I have this this clip, and this is a hard clip to actually color grade, because what's happening is I was shooting in the Adirondacks and the sun was behind a cloud, and then, oops, let's just play here, okay, and then the sun literally came out from the clouds. And so a couple of things happen in that few seconds. First off, the clip gets a lot brighter. My camera did a really good job of adjusting for it in real time. I don't see any flares or anything like that, because I was on auto, which I don't often shoot on auto, but when I was up there, I was more worried about not falling on my face with my snowshoes and just carrying the 100 pounds that I had on my back as opposed to shooting. So I had it on full auto. And then on top of that, the other thing that happened is the color temperature warms up dramatically. So when you have a shot like this where the lighting changes, you have to make some major decisions. And number one is, what part of this clip is the most important? Now you can actually animate color corrections. So you can have a color correction fade into another color correction or something like that. But I would submit to you that that is really difficult to do and match it up to what's actually happening in the clip. It would almost be impossible to get the timing perfect and everything like that. That's not to say that you can't, it's just hard. So to me, the ending of this is actually more important. So I want to kind of color balance for the end, and then if the beginning is really cool and a little colder, then that's fine. And you can see here in your Lumetri that you've got a whole bunch of sliders that you can start changing things with. So the first thing that you have up here, and the first thing that you should always adjust in your clips, is the white balance. I mean, I shouldn't say it's the first thing. If your clip is really dark or there's a massive exposure problem, sometimes it's really hard to adjust your color balance because you can't see very well. So the first thing that you can do is lift up your exposure if you need to, okay? And then once you get it to the point where you can see what you need, now this was exposed pretty well, then you can adjust your color balance. And the color balance is basically two adjustments. One is the color temperature. And if you slide the slider to the left, your shot will become more bluish. If you slide the slider to the right, it adds orange to your clips. If you set it in the middle at 0, that's going to be as shot. Now, color temperature is something that is, I go in my photography class a little bit, and we'll talk about it in a separate demo. White balancing is actually really important for video. But right now, what you want to do is you kind of want to make your highlights relatively neutral. One of the ways you can actually do that is you can slide the slider, or you can check this white balance selector. Now this works most of the time, not all the time. You click this and then you go out into the scene somewhere and you find a place where you have a perfect, neutral, pure white. And it has to be perfect and neutral. So over here the whites are warmer, but down here they're a little cooler. Can you see the blue change here? So here the highlights are very blue, and here they're a lot warmer and a lot orangier. I want to find somewhere where they're neutral. Watch what happens when I click over here on the warmer part. Okay, it subtracts 3.8 on the white balance. Now it was a very subtle change, but if I turn it off and turn it back on again, you might see the difference. It does get a little bit cooler in the colors. It's almost impossible to see on the projector, but I can see it on the monitor just a little bit here. Now, it also changed my tint, which is a red to green color, to a positive 1.7. So it made the color temperature cooler, but then made the tint more magenta. If I zero both of those out, and now I take my white balance and I go down in here to where it's a little bit of a cooler white, and I click, it actually goes the opposite in some ways of what I was expecting, but it takes it and subtracts 4 points bluer and adds 0.9 magenta to it to make it add a little bit magenta, and you can see a subtle, maybe a little bit more of a difference there. So that's one thing that can always help you, is to adjust. You can slide the sliders here, or you can use this little tester, find a good highlight, and it's got to be the purest white you can find. If it's not pure white, then you're going to be, doing something wrong. And because let's just try it. So like if I click here, okay, in the middle of the tree, yeah, oops, yikes. It really makes a huge difference because I'm telling the computer that's my pure white. Well, that's not pure white. It's not even close, right? So the computer's going to try and shift everything to make that pure white, and then you can obviously see we have a massive difference. Okay, let's just go back to 0 and 0 on this. So now one of the things is to use the Lumetri Scopes, you can actually help you find where your purest whites are. So as I play the clip here, watch the Lumetri Scope, and it's actually really cool because you can see how this shot has a big blue cast to it here, and a little bit more green, and almost no red whatsoever. And then down here, this is the shadow areas. So we have shadows at the bottom, highlights at the top. And so you can really see how the highlights have a really high blue cast to them. As I play in real time, you'll see the Lumetri change as the sun comes out in this clip. See that? Pretty cool, okay? It was skipping frames there because I'm also recording this, and this little GPU can't handle that. But you can see how all of a sudden the red went up, okay, and matched or got closer to the greens and the blues here, and so we have a lot less blue. The other cool thing is you can see the spikes here where there's pure white here and here. Look at that. That actually corresponds to the areas here and here. So left to right, what you're actually seeing is the shot stretched across the Lumetri Scope. So for instance, you can see this is a darker area right here, right? There's far less highlights. Well, look, you can see that curve as it goes this way. And then over here we have brighter highlights, and our brightest two splotches are right here and right here are represented by those two splotches there. If I have a shot where I pan, let's see, I got a shot where I pan. Actually, oh, this one's a good one because you can literally see the helmet. So if I pan across, this is a GoPro, you can see the bright highlight here, which is the sun, and then the darker red right there, that's my helmet. See that? And so as this shot pans across, you can watch the helmet move from right to left. See? Pretty cool. And then that back to the off screen again. And you can see the sun, which is this shot here, this part here. Okay, that's your pure white. You can see that move. And you can see how out of balance this shot is. It's way too red. So, now let's go back to the previous shot here where it changes. Okay, so now one of the things that I can do is I can use this Lumetri to take a look at the ending and realize that I've got a lot of blue here, and I want to bring my red back up. And I can see here there's a lot of red in the most highlights, and in the middle there's more blue and green. So what I'm seeing happening here is these medium tones. What do you think these are in the image? These are the trees. Okay, so what you're seeing, this big spike in green and blue here, these are the pine trees. Okay, so they should probably not be completely like equal. But if I look at my highlights, if I look really closely, you can see they've got a lot of magenta and red in the highlights, okay, here. And that's actually pretty much what I want from that. So I'm going to leave my color temperature and my tint alone on this one and continue down the line. But that's the first and most important part of color balancing and grading your image, is getting the color balance right. Because if you don't do that, then every time you change one of these things, you'll realize something new about it, and you'll go back and forth. And I mean, and that happens a little bit anyway, but you want to eliminate that as much as possible. So the next thing is your exposure. If your shot is really underexposed, you can lift this up. And by lifting the exposure, what it does is you can see it kind of lifts the midtones up more than it does the highlights, although it does lift the highlights up a little bit. And that obviously is way too much. So a good shot, you won't have to lift up the midtones too much, or the exposure up at all. I could lift this up a little bit. Once I do that, my highlights get blasted. So I can also kind of take the highlights back down a little bit with this slider And you can see now the trees are a little bit lighter and they've got a little bit more detail in them because I've lifted the exposure up slightly. Bring my highlights and my whites back down. But you don't want to bring your whites down like this. And here's the danger, and this is one of the reasons why this is really nice to have the Lumetri and understand how to read it. This might even look like a pretty decent shot when I brought the whites all the way down. But when you look at the Lumetri, you can see that what I've actually done is I've taken what was a nice pure white and I've dragged it down into the top of the mid-tone area. And so what I've done is I've made these kind of muddy. I mean, in the end, visually, it's most important is how it looks. But I think it's really easy sometimes to bring things down and make things muddy. And it's important to have contrast. So by bringing the whites down like that, I've lost some contrast and lost a little punch in the image. And that we don't want to do. So I can keep the whites up a little higher. But if you look here, I don't have a ton of blacks. So what I might want to do is try and drag my blacks down a little bit and stretch them. And now you can see how the Lumetri is hitting the blacks down here. And down in the image, I'm starting to get better pure blacks in these areas here. And now I've got a touch more contrast in the shot, and it's actually looking a little bit more contrasty. It's got a little bit more punch. And then if I just go through and I play it again, it's subtly better. Okay? And what's kind of cool is because at the beginning, the shadows are a little heavier, okay? As it changes, the shadows kind of lift up and then you see more detail. It's kind of neat. It emphasizes the dark change from dark to light a little bit more. So, and again, that's more of a subjective aesthetic, but you know, you can play with that. We'll lift that up maybe a little bit and kind of go in the middle somewhere, and that's not wrong either. Now, these are just the basics right here. This is just your first thing. Then underneath the basic corrections, you have a whole bunch of other things where you can actually choose some looks here. So you can clean cut. I mean, you can play with stuff. So that, see how that like really bumped the intensity of the contrast? I don't really like it at all. You can try cinema. And truth of the matter is, like if I uncheck what I did, oh, it gets worse. You know, a lot of these, I don't like a lot of these because they're very cookie cutter-ish. They can add a nice look maybe later on. And let me show you how I kind of work with them a little bit better. But you can do that. The problem is it's hard to be consistent from clip to clip. So I usually don't play with these until I do something called an adjustment layer. And then I'll show you that in a second. Also here, curves. If you're used to this from photography or whatever, you can lift certain colors or midtones. So I can grab this curve and I can lift the midtones up. And basically what happened is my highlights, my brightest highlights stayed the same, but the mid areas, the trees, just got a lot brighter. Okay? And we don't want to do that. We can do that pretty well under the basic corrections, but it gives us another way of doing that. I can also click on a specific color and increase a specific color in a certain area. So I can increase the red just in the middles or decrease the red just in the middles and keep the red the same at the highlights. So that's kind of cool. That's when I usually use the curves. If I want to add a color just in the midtones and change something in just that section without changing the highlights or whatever, that's when I'll use curves, but I generally don't use them very often because most of what I want to do I can do in the basic correction. And my general theory is get everything looking very flat, and then we're actually going to add an adjustment layer over top that can give us the subjective colors that we need. So that, you know, that's that. I'll just you know, take this back to normal. I actually kind of like, gives a little bit of a lift in the midtones, is kind of nice. So we'll leave that. The other thing that you can do is you can work with color saturation too, and you can shift the hue to the around the circle to kind of like make things a little bit different. Again, you know, so you bring this down, it makes it black and white, super saturated in the middle somewhere. And you can also change saturation up here in the basic corrections here. You can increase or decrease the saturation any way you want. And these are all animatable too, by the way. So you can like fade from black and white into color over the source of one clip. I'll show you how to animate stuff later. But that's really good. Usually I keep the saturation at about 100% and I'll boost certain clips. A clip that is under or overexposed sometimes needs some saturation boost, because by under or overexposing you've washed out the colors a little bit. So just kind of keep that in mind. That can help you if you've got a shot that's really dark. Color wheels are kind of fun, are a lot of fun. You can actually shift the colors in specific areas, which you can do with the curves layer as well. But let's say I wanted my shadows to be really red, but then I can take my highlights and make them really cool blue. So you can kind of create some really unique colors that way. Again, that's really hard to do clip to clip and be consistent, so it's where adjustment layers come in, which I'll show you later. So I just try and get the most natural and realistic shot I can from each clip to clip. And then if I want to do something as subjective as that, I usually do it to the whole video, right? So I'll do it with an overlying layer that changes everything. Now you have hue saturation and brightness or lightness here, secondary, so I can shift the hue. Whoa. Oh, there we go. I was grabbing the wrong thing. So you can like shift the hue a little bit if you wanted to. It's not making much of a change. Oh, there we go. That's why. And then you can also increase the saturation with this. And a lot of it is just different ways of working. People just like to work different ways, you know, and there's different tools by which to do the same thing. I mean, that's really what it is. That's interesting. Oh, this is for keying too. Oh, this is for keying. I didn't notice that. So this is for green screen work. You can change the green screen keying. So I didn't notice that. So anyway, and then finally you have a vignette. And a vignetting is a fading around the corners. So you can see how I can make it darker around the corners, kind of like tunnel vision. It can make it look older, like older lenses had a lot of vignetting in them. So if you're trying to do something that looks like it's 50s or 40s or 30s, you add a little bit of darkness to the corners. Consequently, any lens that you have might actually have a little vignetting on its own. So you can go the opposite way and add white and lighten the corners to correct for a lens that might not be perfectly even illumination across the boards. Most modern lenses are pretty darn good, but you can play with that. You can change the midpoint, the roundness, and how blurry it is. Okay, so yeah, looks like a picture frame, right? It's really cheesy, you know, but you can totally do that. Does that kind of make sense as far as those are concerned? There's a lot more you can do with color, but your goal with this really, and especially in the beginning, is just to get the nicest shot you can. And honestly, 95% of the time when I'm editing clip to clip, I stay here in the basic corrections. And then I'll do an adjustment layer over top of that, which I'll go over in a later demo. But you know, once you're doing this, you know, just get each clip looking as good in exposure and as neutral balanced as possible. And then if you want to warm up the entire video later and create an emotionally subjective color scheme, I find that the easiest way to do that is with an adjustment layer which goes over top of all your clips, and is nice because you can just do it to a bunch of clips at once. And so it's a lot faster and easier to do it that way than to try and adjust each clip individually. Does that kind of make sense? Think, kind of understand this? The real key here is learning how to read the Lumetri, okay, and then having a good monitor, trusting a good monitor. And then I'll say this, one other little tip is actually when you're adjusting, do two things. One, look away from the monitor every 30, 60 seconds. Your brain literally will get very used to the colors that you're seeing. And actually, there's a biological phenomenon to that where your eyes are using the chemicals that are in your retina. Those chemicals get used up, and your vision actually changes as you stare at the same colors over and over and over again. You can test this by looking at something that's a really bright color for a long time, not blinking, and then if you turn really quickly to a blank wall or something like that, you'll see the inverse of that color in your vision for a while. You ever done that? Or look at a bright light and then you turn away and then you can see the light is still there. That's a biological phenomenon where the chemicals in your eyes actually get used up. That happens here. The other thing that I do is as you're making subtle changes, sometimes it's really hard to see what you've actually done. So I will routinely uncheck the box and look at what I've done and see if I really like it. And as I'm looking at this, I actually kind of like the deeper mid-tones in this when it was untouched. So I might take this and bring my exposure back a little bit, and then I'll check it again and see if I really like the changes that I've made. So that's something I do a lot, and I would highly recommend, is going back and forth and really checking, you know, the changes that you've made and really seeing it for what it is against the original. Does that make sense to everybody?